All right, happy Thursday morning, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back to the podcast, Jeff Beccaro. How you doing, man?
Good, man. How are you doing?
Fantastic. This is a weekly ritual for us. We call each other. We have a list of topics typically in the back of my mind. I'll be like, I got to talk to Jeff about that. And then invariably, your name shows up on my phone or my name shows up on your phone. And then we go into it and we thought, why don't we just try to do it for the podcast? Because we're going to talk about this stuff anyway. Maybe some other people will get some value out of the things that we're thinking about in terms of our businesses, just discussing it.
Yeah, I'm typically calling you trying to figure out why people are the way they are. And you're one of the few people where I feel like I can scream a little bit about, the state of things, and you'll understand that it's coming from a good place.
All right. So we got a list of topics here. We're going to talk a little bit about the quality of the opportunities we're pursuing. We are going to talk about numbers and cadences. You have a lot of experience with this. And then we're going to round it off by talking about some psychology stuff that I've really been nerding out on lately. So let's just jump into this first topic. You kind of wrote it in our text thread. You called it the reverse 1,000-day principle or something like that. Like we're sketching out an idea here in real time. It's not fully baked, but the 1,000-day principle is this concept we've talked about a lot on the show, which tries to explain the feeling of struggle that you typically will find in every founder's story of being behind the ball, being behind the bills, really struggling relative to maybe other people. If you're comparing yourself to others, entrepreneurship typically requires a step back. And that step back often lasts about 1,000 days. And I don't think AI's really changed this. Yes, you see a lot more examples of people seemingly have businesses sprout up out of nowhere. But typically when you dig in, you're going to find like that 1,000-day, one step back, two steps forward sort of story. And so what are you getting at here by flipping the thing on its head and talking about the reverse 1,000-day principle?
Well, I think David McKeegan's great insight with the 1,000-day principle was that you're going to need a lot of endurance to make any business idea work, even a great business idea. And a lot of the AI companies that we see booming right now, really started at least 5 years ago, or people sprouted something up during COVID or whatnot. They've put in the work before the overnight success, right? But that kind of indexes for how we're going to help normal people become entrepreneurs and normal people acclimate themselves to entrepreneurship. And as I've been in this game longer and worked with a few hundred people through the conferences, I've seen a lot of the opposite, where someone really smart and really talented is just banging their head against a bad idea. But if you're sufficiently smart and you're sufficiently hardworking, it's not that hard to pay your rent off a bad idea. But the danger there is that there is this trap where as long as you're covering your expenses, it's easy to be dishonest with yourself about whether it's actually a good idea or you're just wasting your energy kind of limping along. And I speak from personal experience here, having spent the last 10 years banging my head against a couple of different ideas that really didn't have legs beyond just kind of working for myself, which is fine. But a light bulb went off for me at some point last year, in particular working with Kiri Masters on her talk for DCBKK. Kiri founded an unbelievable Amazon marketing agency called Bobsled Marketing and exited recently for, a life-changing multiple. But she had spent, a number of years working on a crafts business, which, did help her learn the Amazon system. But she said, the skills that I had were more or less the same. And the actions I took to sell lamp kits were more or less the same as selling Amazon marketing services and Amazon platform services to Fortune 500 companies. Which of those do you think is going to be more valuable to my career and to the world? And, we talked to other people that weekend, including Matt Newton, who was on, your podcast a couple of months ago, about this sort of 10 years to overnight success phenomenon. And so much of it ended up being landing on the right opportunity. But what it got me thinking about from my own experience and from people I talked to was, how do you have a benchmark to get you out of a bad idea if it's going okay, but it's been going just okay for a long time. So I started thinking about, if you've gone 1,000 days with something and it's just paying the bills, or worse, it's not paying the bills at all. I mean, at a minimum, 1,000 days is enough time to say, I've given this idea its due. Maybe it's not me. Maybe it's the idea. I don't necessarily need to get better or blame myself for mistakes to start fresh and move on. And realistically, I think we're talking more like 500 days or 365 days. If you're the kind of person who has a lot of experience and has really been banging your head against this earnestly, there needs to be some kind of safeguard, in my opinion, to help people know, okay, this is a no-go for the kind of personality type that just wants to keep pushing.
The thought I had, the benchmark seems like a real challenge, because everybody knows that meme where there's like the miner, maybe not everybody knows the meme, but there's a meme where there's a miner that's like like just a few feet away from the gold, and you can see the cross section of the mine, and one miner sort of like gives up and the other one pushes through. But the point is that you don't know where the gold is. And so when do you give up and like walk out of the tunnel? But I don't know if it's exactly true to real life, because we can take that skill set, like the Curie story demonstrates, and simply repackage it or apply it to something that Jay Abraham would call like the highest and best. So the concept there would be like, well, if you're a good car salesperson, why aren't you selling yachts? Why aren't you selling luxury real estate? Because it's essentially the same skill set, but applied to the highest and best. If you're currently selling to the middle of the market, why don't you take the same thing and sell to the top of the market? The thought that occurred to me as a potential benchmark would be, when I think about a lot of 1,000-day stories of endurance, a lot of it is about organizational building, cash flow cycles, hiring, firing. If those struggles are primarily sales and marketing, I think that's when you want to start to question. And so the channel typically is going to define the opportunity. So we could call this the Tailwind index. Like, when you speak with your target market, how excited are they about solving these problems? How willing are they to solve the problems? If you're constantly explaining the reason, you've got two potentials on your plate. Either you're going to absolutely change the world, right? And in which case you might need a bunch of funding to get the product or idea off the ground. Or on the contrary, you're simply not in a good place with a hungry market. And so I guess I would think something like the Tailwind index, which is like, how jacked is your target audience when you talk to them? I consider that to be very important in the first 1,000 days, that you're solving a problem that the market is hungry to get solved.
I completely agree with you. I would come back to the idea of need to have versus nice to have. And there was a point in my career when I was selling copywriting, and there was a point in my career when I was working as a speaker coach, where I noticed that there were predictable rhythms to my year. And in retrospect, those rhythms were the times of year when people had spare cash and focus to spend on nice to haves. So I might rewrite all of my landing pages, or I might invest in a new sales letter, or I might get busy during conference season. But the rest of the year, there's no burning need to go out and find someone to help with those things. And working in sales now and helping founders, fix their sales process or execute their sales process for them, that's something that's going on 52 weeks a year. If you're not selling, you're dying. And so it's a very different conversation when you talk to someone about how are we going to make sure that you've got sales coming in the door versus how are we going to invest in this thing that might pay you back over the course of the next, call it year to 3.
So for a frame of reference, you were doing kind of sales consulting via copywriting for many years, and now you're doing sales consulting via actually doing sales calls and running sales processes. That's my understanding. Can you let us know a little bit about what Wingman does?
And so the common thread through everything I've done over the last 10 years is I've got a skill for helping people package what they do and tell a story of their career, a story of their business in a way that makes people convert. As to how I ended up working with people, both fixing and then actually taking over their sales process for them, was ultimately trying everything else that didn't work first. So don't be like me, kids. Pull the plug earlier. But what we do now is we work with 7-figure founders who are looking to get, up to mid 7-figure or even 8 over the course of the next few years. They've got a message that works. They've got product market fit, but they either don't have a sales team or they have a sales team that's underperforming. And most importantly, I work with founders where it's taking up a ton of their time. So we're able to come in, we're able to systemize things so that they are repeatable and predictable. We're able to train up the team that they have. And then most importantly, we're able to take over, call it 90% of the time that the founder spends on the phone, so they can get back to things like recruiting. They can get back to things like managing the team, and most importantly, delivering for the clients, so that we help them take that initial leap out of founder sales being a massive drain on what they do and everything else in the business taking away from the sales process, to being able to stay in that visionary role.
Because a lot of people are like, well, I'd love to change my business, but I just don't have another idea. And I think, just observing from the outside, the light bulb moment is realizing that effective sales teams for sub $5 million businesses are almost always the founder on the phone. Right. And so I remember us sitting around at one point and we were like, founder phone. That's something. Like, if the founder phone existed, you know what I mean? Like, that would be huge. It'd be so valuable. Imagine if there was a founder phone that performed as well as the founder, because the reality is we're not building sales teams until we're over 3, 4, 5 million in revenue. And so we're still picking up the phone, and that means we're not doing other things to build the business. And so, like you said, it's a 52-week problem. It's a burning problem that everybody can recognize, even if there's not like an off-the-shelf solution for it in the form of a SaaS or whatever. That's where business opportunities pop up, And like I said, it's not a nice to have. It's like a need to have. I've got 10 hours of calls this week. I need to have them go well.
And where the light bulb went off, and where I think people should look for ideas that are maybe more valuable than what they're doing, is hearing repeated problems from a variety of people. And the repeated problems that I heard over and over again, when I look back at the conferences that I've worked on in particular, is people are either spending way too much of their time on the phone as a founder, totally stuck in the role. And if they're honest with themselves, it's a mess. It's all spread between their inbox and their calendar, their to-do list. Nothing's getting done at quite the level they would like it to be done, because they just don't have the time running a business and everything else that they need to be doing at the same time. The other thing that I heard repeated over and over again is that people were delegating too quickly. They were delegating to low-level staff, and they were essentially saying, please, for the love of God, fix this for me. Just take it to someone who they were paying, call it $20 an hour somewhere overseas. And that's fine once there's a sales process in place, and once the problem has been solved, essentially, once they have product market fit and a winning message and a repeatable process that they can use to execute that the same way over and over. But what most people were doing was they were saying, just get me out of here because I am so desperate to get my time back. So once you hear that enough times in a row, once someone beats you over the head with the same idea time after time, saying yes to that gets a little bit easier. So the way that it came about was sort of me having this dark night of the soul that I've tried a million different ways of reinventing the same wheel at the same time that the market is telling me we're looking for this, we're looking for this, we're looking for this. And finally taking a step back to just listen to what people needed help with and finding a way to connect what I had access to and the skill set that I had to the problem that people kept asking me to solve.
Well, I think the challenge with a lot of that is you can hear those problems for years and be like, try to repackage whatever you're currently doing and insist that it solves it.
100% agree. And if you find yourself explaining why what you do is valuable or why it's the right way and they're doing things the wrong way, you've already lost and you haven't really listened to what people want. And there may be a situation that comes where you think that you've got a more elegant solution or that you've, invented the light bulb. I'm here to tell you no one cares. And that what actually drives purchasing behavior and what actually drives people to make a change is, It's the vitamins versus aspirin thing. You can tell them they need to take things for their long-term health, but what they really want is to be out of pain.
You know, if we're talking on the phone on our weekly call, it's sort of like, well, what are those benchmarks out there? Like, how do you know if you just need to press a little bit further to figure out how your product market fit's going to work, or do you need to pivot into something? And I've been tempted to say, like, the less capital you have, the more aspirin you need. So if you're like hugely capitalized, if you're wealthy, if it's your third startup, if you have investors, you can make a fancy vitamin, you know? You can build a CPG brand that does hydration water that people love to take at the gym or whatever. But if you're looking to replace your income from a job in the next 90 days or 360 days, I think the answer is clearly aspirin and finding the problem, the hell yes, the strong tailwind, the immediate resonance, and shelving the good idea, and instead serving others and saying, well, I'm going to be a vessel for their vision, and I'm going to solve their problem, get in line with their wants, and ultimately whatever you develop as your grand vision long-term will be served by that practice, your first 1,000 days of focusing on pain points versus nice to haves. Now, there's always going to be people that sit back with the mindset that I could be the exception. And that's cool. That's like part of the entrepreneurial spirit. You know, like, well, I could be the one. And I've read about a person who did this. I will say this. You read about the New York Times writing about bootstrappers, and, you know, everybody listening to this knows a lot about bootstrapping. And so you read that article and you're like, man, these journalists like really did not take any time to understand this topic. I'll never trust the news again. If you were to really do strong journalism on a lot of these business success stories, which is what we do at conferences, you dig in. 9 times out of 10, you will have an aha moment that it was not so-and-so took advantage of this tool and made X amounts. It was like, oh, their parents did this for 10 years and then they came from a career where they learned this critical thing. There's often a strong competitive advantage baked into the story that was not revealed in the tweet, the social media post, the Fortune magazine coverage of that story. And 9 times out of 10, if you took the time to do the research, you would find some kind of 1,000-day ramp up, some kind of deep competitive advantage that makes the story way less interesting. Because the whole story dies if you find out that, oh, their dad was in that industry for 20 years. Or they had $250,000 in the bank when they did that and didn't work for 2 years. You know, there's a lot of this kind of stuff in the background. Be careful about comparison and be careful about benchmarking if you don't have a strong handle on the depth of the narrative.
Put another way, don't believe 100% of anything that you read. And in particular, if it's about a business that's working well, they're not going to give away their edge on a podcast.
There you go.
You know, I think back to your point about advice to people who think they might be stuck. If you think you might be stuck, I think you probably are. And the immediacy of product market fit is really remarkable once you find it. And it will make you look back and kick yourself about all the things that you tried to make work. And just because you are tough enough and you are brave enough to keep banging on an idea doesn't mean that there isn't a better use of your time, and that, frankly, you deserve to be working on it with the time that you have.
If you were to call 50 people in your target market, how would you say, like, what's our tailwind index here? Like, what should be the response from those 50 people?
Hell yeah. Are you serious? Wait, really? They try to clarify some detail is actually real because they kind of can't believe it's too good to be true at the price that you're charging. They want to say yes, but they can't say yes right now, but they'll say yes in a month. You're getting questions about how quick they can get started and if it'll really deliver what they are hearing versus why you're doing something.
I love that. Cool. Curious to hear what the audience thinks about that one. Jeff, we talked about at the top, we promised we wanted to talk about numbers a little bit. And numbers have been a theme of my week because we recently finished our monthly numbers meeting. And this is something we didn't have in the past. We have now. It's extremely empowering. And I know you deal with numbers all the time. So I'm wondering if you could give us a little insight into the bootstrapper approach to numbers.
One of my favorite clients that I work with is Sam Hill from Ecom CFO. And what they do is provide fractional controllers and fractional CFOs specifically for e-commerce businesses. And as a result, I've gotten exposure to a great many businesses that I would never have known about otherwise, and gotten much more familiar with both how these accounting roles work in these organizations, and in particular, how many people aren't using them or don't know their numbers at all. And if they have a bookkeeper, I say if, because there are a mind-blowing number of businesses doing millions of dollars a year who don't really even know if they're profitable, sometimes until they go broke 5 years down the line. I've just been really struck by the lack of interest and curiosity that people have about the finances within their business. And I say finances because I'm thinking of personal finance and how we all make idiotic mistakes when we're 23 years old. And we spend too much on a car loan, or we blow out a credit card that we can't pay off, or we spend God knows how much on interest, working that off over time. And the adult thing to do is to take those lumps and have that be a lesson for you if you didn't have, the kind of parents that taught you how to balance a checkbook, and say, well, I'm never going to do that again. That really sucked. But I think because the potential in entrepreneurship is so great to just grow and grow and grow, it's easy to get blinded by, the hockey stick up and to the right. And to some extent, we live in a numbers go up economy right now, thanks to, the stock market and Robinhood and options trading and crypto and everything else that has been memeified over the last 10 years. But if you've got hard goods and you have hard costs and you're writing 6 or 7 figure purchase orders, it really matters that that's going to be a profitable order for you, and within a safe margin that you don't wake up having wasted 8 years of your career thinking you were making millions of dollars when really you were slowly going broke.
It's not 7-figure purchase orders for most of us, it's our payroll. And a lot of us, because we don't know our numbers, we actually don't think of payroll in terms of an investment. 2 thoughts on this. One is that what is your cadence for looking at these financials? Who are you digging into the numbers with strategically and making sure that you're making the most of your opportunity right now? It's like the Dave Ramsey thing with personal finance. When you take the lump, you decide that every dollar is a foot soldier going to work for me. I thought your point about the entrepreneurial optimism is so relatable. In fact, early in my career, I worked for somebody who embodied this, that we are in this industry where we see people blowing up, and maybe this dollar helps me to blow up. What I'm finding is typically that responsibility will, for most of us, lie on the founder's desk and not on those dollars going out the door. And that's your opportunity, your foot soldier, to go to work for you. A similar mindset can get us into the bad personal finance decisions. I'm just going to buy the car now and I'll figure it out later. I'm going to move to the city and, I'm going to get this job, and I'll be able to pay it all off someday because I have this great career now. And we have a similar mindset often when we start a business, that someday the business will be dimensional and none of these decisions are going to matter right now. What I would like to suggest is to have a monthly financial review, which we just had ours. We call it the MBR, the monthly business review. We sit down, we take a look at our finances year over year. We take a look at all of our outbounds and make sure that We believe these are great investments, that we're meeting our targets and that we're adjusting quickly and making hard decisions based on the performance of the capital in our business. We want to make the most out of the business right now, and check in on that every single month. It's empowering, the same way that taking control of your personal financial situation is empowering. I think the important point here is that most of us are stuck with either business coach, mastermind partners, bookkeepers, and accountants, none of which can really do this for you. So herein presents the challenge. If we don't have financial knowledge or comfort with these systems, how do we get them? And for me, I think it's essential that founders go out and get a fractional CFO, a controller, somebody to coach them based on intimate knowledge of their numbers. So to simplify, every single month, at least to get started, and you might be able to perpetuate this every month if you pick up enough knowledge if you're a smaller business, you need to be reviewing your numbers with someone who understands every single number and is able to ask harder questions than maybe the higher level question that a business coach would ask about the growth side of things, about the improvement side of things. We need to ask about that basic financial hygiene. Like, why are we spending all this money? Are we meeting the targets? And for us, like, once we've gone to this format of every single month doing a monthly business review, complete financial rundown, I can't imagine running a business ever again without this. Doing the vague, like, what kind of cash showed up in my bank account math. What we're doing is we're creating a ton of inefficiency in the limited amount of capital that we have to invest in our business. We want to make sure when dollars go out, a multiple of dollars come back in. That's business. We want to have it be like blowing up, getting rich, buying Lambos, but at the core, this is what those folks are doing. And for bootstrappers, it's not that expensive. You will get an ROI on a part-time controller or fractional financial professional.
I think you make a really great point about how important it is when the business is small, because it's easy to say that this is something that I'll do when my business hits 6 figures or something I'll do when my business hits 7 figures. But when you really have a limited amount of capital to deploy and you have a very high level of risk, I would argue that even if you're doing this, an hour a month with someone who you found on Upwork, it's still more important for you to make sure you're making the best decisions at that level than waiting for some magical day in the future when you can get serious about your finances.
100%. And I think we've done this too, where you can easily spend like years like waiting for a payoff versus getting paid off every month and making that decision every single month to make your business make sense. The final thing I want to talk about is, I talked about it on last week's pod, but I want to share with you, the ideas of this book that I've been sort of like going back in and rereading different chapters of this book called The Courage to be Disliked. 3 horsemen of psychology. There's Freud, there's Jung, and there's Adler. And Adler's the horseman that everybody forgot about, except for, importantly, Stephen Covey, who famously wrote one of the biggest self-help books of all time, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He was highly influenced by this character Adler. Be Disliked is a really interesting popularization and distillation of this philosophy that has inspired so many entrepreneurs. And the concept is in some ways the project of all psychology, which is not just to understand ourselves for the sake of it, although there's some value there, but to understand ourselves in order to make positive changes. And Adler really disagrees with a lot of the approaches that Jung and Freud schools of thinking take, because he believes that they are too retrospective and thus deterministic. So when we like sort of look back on our histories and we create these calcified narratives about who we are and why we do things, we might not be able to be flexible, like you said in the first point, and change what we're doing in order to have better outcomes in our business. The theme of the book is really courage. And so courage to do what is to stop making emotional justifications for our behaviors. So a good example that I think we all can relate to is the emotion of anger. So imagine somebody points out something that, say, somewhere in your soul, you know there's something true about it, like a critique. And one of the ways you can manage or control that critique, because it might be painful to hear, is to get angry at the person who said the critique. And we might carry that anger for many months or years afterwards as a justification for not doing anything about it. Maybe if you're thinking about like the more popular forms of psychology, you're tempted to say, well, like, I know why I'm angry. I get angry when things like this happen. And the Adler School of Philosophy is basically saying you are using anger as a toolkit to not do something. And once you realize that, you could change anger with another emotion. You could have the courage to say, well, I will instead be curious or interested. That takes courage, but it creates the opportunity for change.
I had a mentor when I was young, and your classic, like, angry hormonal teenager who finally had enough of me going on and on about it and said, like, all right, let's assume everything you say is true, Jeff, and you're right, and they're wrong, and everything is deeply unfair. Cool. What are we going to do about it? And I've thought about that a lot the rest of my life. It's funny how throwaway lines like that can make an impact on you. But ultimately, even if everything that happened to you before is true and a deeply unfair disadvantage that you have, that's not going to make any difference in your life tomorrow if you don't start doing something differently about it. So I can see why, Adler's innovation here is really appealing to someone like Stephen Covey that's trying to help people who are looking to be more effective.
I would say like 90% of the negative book reviews on Goodreads about this book are from people who are strong believers in the concept and the value of trauma. And so this book is very polarizing on that point where it discounts trauma. There's no question that there's value in the concept of negative galvanizing experiences and how they affect a person. The question is exactly what you're pointing to, which is like, how useful is it? And I think an ideal place to practice a lot of these things are in our businesses. Because in the book, Courage to be Disliked, the bigger your business gets, the more people will dislike you. So it's an excellent place to practice this philosophy of understanding where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins. I heard this awesome like DC anecdote today. One of our new team members went to their first Connect call in the DC, and they were like a team member. So they showed up to these calls and they were like, how's it going in the DC, doing the team member thing. And then both members were like, hey, how can I help you? Like, I know you're new in the DC. How can I help you be better at your job? And I remember speaking with her after the call, and I was like, that's it. Like, that's the DC thing, is like they're trying to contribute. And there's an insight there, which is this is a pathway to happiness and wellness. Is if trauma is a big specter that's always right behind your ears, it's hard to enter any interaction and not minister to it. Like, I've got to get something to sort this thing out right now because I'm the type of person that has this and I got to do something, versus looking across the table and saying, I'm not here to manage what other people think of me. I'm here to contribute in some way. And it does seem like a interesting way to approach life.
I got really lucky in this regard, having a professor when I was young. Their real job outside of the university was working as a clinical psychologist. And they explained to me at some point that there is a school of thought that's probably not super popular, that like the truth of a patient's life doesn't matter quite as much as constructing a narrative that's going to help them move forward and be healthy and happy. And that's really touching the third rail for any psychologists that are listening. So please don't report me to the board that I'm not a member of. I think that there's something to take away from that about the narrative that we choose to fulfill in our own life. And we can't control what happened to us before right now. We can maybe manipulate the way that we think about it. But what we can control is the story that we're trying to write for the rest of our lives and who we want to be. And I found that enormously empowering as a young person. And I think when you meet DCers and you meet an awful lot of entrepreneurs, there has been that moment, sometimes 4 or 5 moments, where they kind of said, all right, I'm putting on a new hat this morning, and now I'm going to be that guy. I drove past a truck the other day that was the mobilestorageguy.com. And I don't know him. If you're listening, props to you. But one day he woke up and said, this is what I'm going to do for the next 5 years. And he's got storage units all over my neighborhood, presumably making a mint.
There's this concept in the book of basically that we suffer when we don't effectively separate tasks. And a lot of human suffering comes from interpersonal strife, from worrying about things that aren't actually our responsibility. So, an interesting thought experiment. What is your responsibility? Let's talk about it in a business context. The idea is that, you're supposed to advise, inform, guide, but the moment you try to coerce and control another individual, which is, let's face it, a lot of us look at business that way. We want to coerce, we want to control. Well, it is going to lead to a lot of interpersonal strife, because how that person acts isn't your responsibility. How they end up thinking about you isn't your responsibility. Your responsibility is to have the courage to face what is on your plate. And this can also help you cut ties faster, because a lot of us can use that as an excuse. This person doesn't listen to me. I'm resenting this and that. But actually, what you don't want to do is sever the relationship and go through the pain of them not liking you because of that. So it's easier to feel the feelings of negative emotions associated with not being able to coerce them enough.
Well, I think it's super relatable to entrepreneurship in 2 capacities. Is one, almost everyone who I've talked to over the last 10 years has got some story about a key hire who they hung on to for too long. Maybe a key client, but somebody where they let their emotional feelings about the situation, whether it was sympathy, whether it was loyalty, whether it was faith to some degree or insecurity, get in the way of them taking a look at the fact that the relationship was no longer serving the business. But getting rid of somebody is really emotionally difficult for a lot of entrepreneurs. Never really gets easy, I would say, but over time it does get easier. And so I think that courage to be disliked is really important for taking a look at your contractors, looking at your staff, or even looking at some of your clients who might be paying you a lot of money, but taking even more out of the business and out of your team. The other place that I see this constantly right now is working with entrepreneurs on their sales process and on their pipeline, and people who take their sales process way too personally. I will not tell you that people don't get a great natural high off of closing a big deal. But the other side of that is that I see people take losses very personally who really shouldn't. There are people out there who want to light 6 figures on fire every single month, and they have no urgency at all about doing anything about it. You won't figure that person out. They've got their own thing going on. So a lot of the people that I work with will endlessly work leads who haven't had the honesty to say this isn't a good fit right now, or I don't feel strongly enough about this, or to be blunt enough to say, I don't really think you can help. And it seems like it's harmless because it's just your time. But what that adds up to is a pipeline that are absolutely full of stale leads that you're working on and on again. And you're both spending actual, minutes and hours of your precious time on it, as well as the mental bandwidth, just to avoid marking something as a loss. marking something as closed, or even popping it into a nurture sequence and saying, I'm not going to think about that person again, because it feels like you've done something wrong. You haven't executed the process right. You haven't addressed the objections correctly. Your price was wrong. Your offer was poor, on and on and on. And maybe there's truth to that, but even if it's true that you didn't do the best job you could do, it's just not worth your time. But it feels like people are enacting all of this psychological stuff when really they're ultimately just selling like ice cream cones to kids that didn't want them.
Or you're feeling invalidated.
100%. Right. And so you don't have the opportunity to make that contribution, or you feel like your contribution wasn't valued. And at the end of the day, for them, it's just a dollars and cents transaction, and they're not even thinking about you anymore.
Right.
All the time that you spend worrying about someone who isn't a good fit for you is time that you could be spending on making your team feel more empowered, making your clients feel like they're getting a better service, going above and beyond with the things that are working, and contributing more to those people than worrying about the validation that you lost from people that are long gone.
Yeah, yeah. And getting over that sting that is so relatable seems to be like the path the book is laying out, is that is the courage to be disliked. That is self-realization. That is a sense of virtue and confidence in what you are doing, that you are a contributor. And that if someone else doesn't recognize that right now, that's not your responsibility.
Like they used to say back in the 70s, F them if they can't take a joke.
Jeff, thank you for contributing today. I hope you got some sort of fulfillment and or maybe even, dare I say, happiness out of it. You can find out more about Jeff at meetwingman.com, helping you with your founder-led sales, which is most of us. Thanks for joining us this week on the podcast, Jeff.
Pleasure, man. Look forward to seeing you in Mexico.